Karen Whitmore stood at her kitchen window, coffee mug trembling in her manicured hands, watching in absolute horror as her twin 8-year-olds cannonballed into the Hendersons' pool for the third time that morning. The splash was so enormous, it sent water cascading over the privacy fence and onto her prized begonias. "Madison, Mason," she shrieked, her voice carrying across the pristine lawns of Willowbrook Estates like a banshee's wail. "Get out of there this instant." But her children, oblivious to her maternal fury, continued their aquatic rampage. Madison had discovered that jumping off the pool's edge while holding a beach ball created an even bigger splash. While Mason was attempting what appeared to be synchronized drowning with a pool noodle, Karen's eye twitched. The same involuntary spasm that had developed during her contentious 3-year tenure as HOA president. She'd worked tirelessly to maintain the neighborhood's standards, citing tooth and nail against residents who dared to plant the wrong shade of rosebush or install mailboxes that deviated from the approved bronze finish. And now her own children were turning the Hendersons' backyard into some kind of water-themed circus. The irony wasn't lost on her. Just 6 months ago, she'd successfully lobbied the HOA board to implement strict pool regulations after the Johnsons installed what she deemed an inappropriately large hot tub. The new rules required written permission for any pool activities that might disturb neighbors, mandatory pool covers during non-use hours, and a complete ban on inflatable decorations that could be deemed aesthetically incompatible with neighborhood standards. "This is exactly the kind of chaos I've been trying to prevent," Karen muttered, watching Mason attempt to ride a unicorn float like a mechanical bull. She'd spent countless evenings drafting regulations, attending board meetings, and conducting wellness checks on neighbor compliance. Her dedication to neighborhood excellence had earned her both respect and the kind of barely concealed hatred usually reserved for parking meter attendants. The Hendersons, unfortunately, had installed their pool before Karen's regulations took effect, grandfathering them out of most restrictions. Tom Henderson, a soft-spoken accountant with the audacity to wear Hawaiian shirts while mowing his lawn, had been annoyingly compliant with every other HOA rule. He kept his grass at the regulation 2.5-inch height, painted his trim the approved coastal sage color, and even removed his Christmas lights by January 2nd instead of pushing it to Epiphany, like some heathens she could mention. But this pool situation was spiraling out of control. Karen had first noticed the problem 3 weeks ago when Madison and Mason discovered they could see directly into the Hendricksons' backyard from their bedroom window. What started as innocent curiosity had evolved into full-scale aquatic invasion. The Henderson kids, apparently possessed of the same generous spirit as their father, had initially welcomed her children's pool visits. Tom had even waved cheerfully. When he caught Karen spying she corrected herself from her kitchen window. That wave had been Karen's undoing. She'd interpreted it as permission, a neighborly gesture that surely extended to reasonable pool access for Madison and Mason. After all, the children were friends, weren't they? And friends shared things. The fact that neither she nor her husband Mark had formally discussed pool privileges with the Hendersons seemed like a minor oversight. They're probably happy to have playmates for Emma and Jake, Karen had rationalized, to Mark over dinner. We're doing them a favor, really. Social interaction is important for child development. Mark, who worked 60-hour weeks as a software engineer specifically to avoid neighborhood politics, had merely grunted his agreement. While scrolling through his phone, his strategy for surviving Karen's HOA presidency involved strategic deafness and the occasional supportive nod. It had worked for 3 years, and he saw no reason to change tactics now. But Karen's rationalization was crumbling as she watched Madison attempt to execute what appeared to be a belly backflip hybrid that sent water cascading over the pool deck like a tidal wave. The Henderson children were nowhere to be seen, probably hiding inside from the aquatic apocalypse her offspring had unleashed. The situation had escalated over the past week. Madison and Mason had begun treating the Henderson pool like their personal water park, arriving each morning with an arsenal of pool toys, floats, and what appeared to be a homemade diving board constructed from a boogie board and a step stool. They'd established elaborate games that involved maximum splashing, created whirlpools by running in circles, and had somehow convinced the neighborhood's other children to join their daily pool parties. Yesterday, Karen had counted 11 children in the Henderson pool simultaneously, all shrieking with the kind of joy that could be heard 3 blocks away. The Hendersons' water bill was probably approaching mortgage payment levels, and their pool filter was working overtime to process the sunscreen, grass clippings, and mysterious debris that seemed to accumulate whenever children gathered near water. "This cannot continue," Karen announced to her empty kitchen, her voice carrying the same authoritative tone she used during HOA board meetings. She'd built her reputation on maintaining order, and watching her own children single-handedly destroy neighborhood tranquility was both ironic and infuriating. She grabbed her phone and scrolled through her contacts. Pausing at Henderson, Tom neighbor, her finger hovered over the call button. A direct conversation would be the mature approach, the kind of diplomatic solution she'd recommend to other residents facing similar conflicts. But something held her back, perhaps the memory of Tom's cheerful wave, or the realization that She'd been allowing this situation to continue without proper authorization. Instead, she opened her HOA president email account and began drafting what she mentally labeled as a gentle reminder about pool etiquette and neighborhood courtesy. If Tom Henderson wanted to run a water park in his backyard, he needed to understand the implications for property values, noise ordinances, and community standards. As she typed, another massive splash echoed across the yard, followed by Madison's triumphant shriek of "Did you see that one, Mom?" Karen's eye twitched again, and her gentle reminder evolved into something considerably more formal. "Dear Mr. Henderson," she began, her fingers clicking across the keyboard with increasing intensity. "It has come to my attention that your pool facilities have become a source of significant neighborhood disruption." 20 minutes later, Karen hit send on what could generously be described as a diplomatic missile. The email outlined 12 specific violations of neighborhood courtesy, referenced 7 different HOA regulations that could potentially apply to excessive pool usage, and included a detailed schedule of acceptable pool hours that would minimize disruption to neighboring properties. She'd also attached a copy of the noise ordinance, a reminder about property line boundaries, and a subtle suggestion that perhaps the Hendersons might consider implementing a reservation system for pool access to better manage the crowd control issues that were clearly developing. The email concluded with Karen's standard closing, working together to maintain the exceptional standards that make Willowbrook Estates the premier residential community in the greater metropolitan area. Sincerely, Karen Whitmore, HOA President. As she closed her laptop, Karen felt the familiar satisfaction that came with addressing neighborhood issues through proper channels. She'd documented the problem, offered constructive solutions, and maintained her professional demeanor throughout. Tom Henderson would undoubtedly appreciate her proactive approach to conflict resolution. Another splash, this one somehow even larger than the previous attempts, sent water arcing over the fence like a fountain. A beach ball followed the water, landing squarely in Karen's herb garden with a wet thud that scattered her perfectly arranged basil plants. Madison's voice carried across the yard with crystalline clarity. "Sorry, Mrs. Whitmore. We're just having so much fun. Mr. Henderson said we could stay all morning." Karen's coffee mug shattered against the kitchen floor, sending ceramic shards and lukewarm coffee across her pristine tile. Her eye wasn't just twitching now, it was practically vibrating. The sound of children's laughter, which she'd once found charming during neighborhood barbecues, now struck her as a personal assault on everything she'd worked to achieve. She grabbed a towel and began cleaning up the coffee, her movements sharp and precise. The Henderson situation required more than diplomatic emails and gentle reminders. If Tom Henderson wanted to encourage this kind of chaos, he needed to understand that actions had consequences, and Karen Whitmore hadn't spent 3 years as HOA president without learning how to enforce community standards. As she swept up the ceramic fragments, a plan began forming in her mind. The Hendersons might have installed their pool before her regulations took effect, but there were other rules, older regulations that predated her presidency: noise ordinances, property maintenance standards, and neighborhood courtesy, guidelines that applied to every resident regardless of when they'd installed their aquatic facilities. Karen smiled for the first time that morning, but it wasn't the warm expression she reserved for neighborhood social gatherings. This was her HOA president's smile, the one that had convinced 3 different residents to remove unauthorized. Tom Henderson was trimming his roses when his phone chimed with Karen's email. He paused, clippers in hand, to read what he assumed would be a friendly note about the children. After all, Karen had seemed pleased enough when she'd waved at him through her kitchen window yesterday. The kids were having fun, no one was getting hurt, and Emma and Jake had been begging for more pool parties all summer. By the time he finished reading, Tom's expression had shifted from confused to concerned to something approaching panic. The email wasn't a friendly note, it was a formal declaration of war disguised as neighborly correspondence. "Honey," he called to his wife Sarah, who was inside preparing snacks for the growing crowd of children, "you need to read this." Sarah emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of orange slices and juice boxes, her blonde hair tied back in the practical ponytail of a mother expecting a day of pool supervision. "Read what? Please tell me it's not another one of Karen's surveys about mailbox maintenance." Tom handed her his phone silently. Sarah's face underwent the same transformation his had moments earlier. Confusion, concern, then a kind of horrified fascination as she absorbed the full scope of Karen's grievances. 12 violations? Sarah's voice rose an octave. She counted 12 separate violations of neighborhood courtesy. "We're letting children swim in our pool. Apparently we're operating an unauthorized recreational facility that's creating significant noise pollution and degrading property values throughout the adjacent residential zone." Tom read over her shoulder. "She's also concerned about our failure to implement proper crowd control measures and our disregard for established quiet hour protocols." Sarah scrolled through the attachments, her eyes widening with each document. "She sent us the municipal noise ordinance and something called HOA Regulation Enforcement Procedures, Revised Edition." "Tom, there are 43 pages of attachments. She's been busy," Tom muttered, watching Madison and Mason attempt synchronized cannonballs while his own children cheered from the pool deck. The sight that had brought him joy 5 minutes ago now looked like evidence in a legal proceeding. What are we supposed to do? Tell the kids they can't swim anymore because Karen measured the decibel levels of their laughter. Tom was about to respond when his phone rang. Karen's name appeared on the screen, and both he and Sarah stared at it like it might explode. She's calling, Sarah whispered unnecessarily. I can see that. Are you going to answer? Yes. Maybe. This is insane. Tom accepted the call, putting it on speaker so Sarah could hear the conversation. Hello, Karen. Tom, thank you for taking my call. I assume you've had a chance to review my email regarding the ongoing situation with your pool facilities. Karen's voice carried the crisp professionalism she reserved for HOA business, but Tom detected something else underneath that tightly controlled excitement, as if she'd been waiting for this conversation all morning. I have, Tom said carefully. Karen, I have to say, I'm a bit surprised by the scope of your concerns. The kids are just swimming. Tom, I appreciate that you may view this as simple recreation, but we need to consider the broader implications for neighborhood standards and community harmony. When children are using your pool for 6 hours a day, creating noise levels that can be heard 3 blocks away, and bringing unauthorized equipment that could pose safety hazards, we're moving beyond casual swimming into unauthorized commercial recreation territory. Sarah's mouth fell open. Commercial recreation. They were giving away juice boxes and letting neighborhood kids splash around. Karen, Tom said, struggling to keep his voice level. I think there might be some misunderstanding. Here, we're not running a business. We're just. Tom, I've documented 17 separate instances of noise violations over the past week. Madison and Mason have been in your pool for a combined total of 42 hours, which exceeds the recreational facility usage guidelines outlined in Municipal Code 847.3b. Tom blinked. You've been timing how long the kids swim. Documentation is essential for proper neighborhood management. Tom, without accurate records, how can we address community concerns effectively? Sarah grabbed Tom's arm, her eyes wide with disbelief. Karen had been sitting in her kitchen with a stopwatch, timing children's pool activities like some kind of aquatic surveillance operation. Karen, they're 8 years old. They're not violating municipal codes by swimming in our pool. Tom, I understand your desire to be neighborly, but we have to consider precedent. If every family in Willowbrook Estates decides to operate informal, recreational facilities without proper oversight, we could see a complete breakdown of community standards. Property values, noise levels, insurance liability. These issues affect everyone. Tom was beginning to understand that he wasn't having a conversation with his neighbor about pool etiquette. He was being cross-examined by the HOA president about violations he didn't know existed. What exactly are you asking us to do, Karen? I'm proposing a reasonable compromise that addresses everyone's concerns. First, we establish scheduled pool hours that respect neighborhood quiet time. 7 a.m. to 9 a.m. and 1 p.m. to 5 p.m. would be appropriate for active recreation. Second, we implement a guest registration system to ensure proper oversight of non-resident pool usage. Third, we establish equipment guidelines that eliminate safety hazards and noise amplification devices. Tom looked at Sarah, who was shaking, her head frantically. Equipment guidelines. Madison's pool noodle was apparently a noise amplification device. And fourth, Karen continued, we need proper insurance documentation and liability waivers for any children who aren't immediate family members. The HOA Insurance Committee would need to review your homeowner's policy to ensure adequate coverage for recreational facility operation. Karen, it's a pool in our backyard. We're not running a water park. Tom, I appreciate your informal approach, but we have to consider worst-case scenarios. What happens if someone gets hurt? What happens if property damage occurs? What happens if noise complaints escalate to municipal authorities? These are the kinds of issues that can devastate property values and community reputation. Sarah stepped closer to the phone. Karen, this is Sarah. Are you telling us that our children can't have friends over to swim? Sarah, of course they can have friends over, but we need structure, documentation, and proper oversight. The current situation is simply too chaotic for a residential neighborhood of Willowbrook Estates caliber. Our kids have been swimming with Madison and Mason for 3 weeks. No one's been hurt, no property has been damaged, and the only complaints we've received are coming from you. Karen's voice sharpened slightly. Sarah, just because other residents haven't filed formal complaints doesn't mean they aren't concerned. Many people are uncomfortable with confrontation and prefer to let HOA leadership address community issues through proper channels. Have other people actually complained? Or are you assuming they would complain if they had proper channels? There was a pause on Karen's end, and Tom realized they'd stumbled onto something important. Karen's entire case seemed to be built on hypothetical concerns and potential violations rather than actual neighbor complaints. The specific source of concerns isn't as important as addressing them proactively, Karen said finally. Prevention is always preferable to crisis management. Tom made a decision that would later prove to be either brilliant or catastrophically stupid. Karen, I appreciate your concerns, but we're not implementing registration systems or equipment guidelines for children swimming in our pool. If other neighbors have specific complaints, they're welcome to talk to us directly." The silence on Karen's end stretched long enough that Tom wondered if the call had dropped. "Tom," Karen said finally, her voice carrying a new edge, "I was hoping we could resolve this through voluntary cooperation. But if you're unwilling to work within established community standards, there are other approaches available." "Are you threatening us?" "I'm informing you that the HOA has enforcement mechanisms designed to protect community interests when voluntary compliance isn't achieved. I'd prefer to avoid those measures, but they exist for situations exactly like this." Sarah grabbed the phone from Tom's hands. "Karen, if you have a problem with children swimming in our pool, maybe you should talk to your own children about asking permission before using other people's property." The silence that followed was so complete that Tom could hear Karen's breathing through the phone. "My children," Karen said slowly, "we're operating under the reasonable assumption that your invitation was genuine and ongoing. If that's no longer the case, they'll obviously respect your property boundaries." "That's not what I meant," Sarah started. "I think we've covered the important points," Karen interrupted. "Tom, Sarah, you'll be receiving additional correspondence outlining the HOA's position on this matter. I encourage you to review those materials carefully and reconsider your approach to neighborhood cooperation." The line went dead. Tom and Sarah stared at each other, then at the phone, then back at each other. "Did we just get threatened by the HOA president?" Sarah asked. "I think we got threatened by Karen wearing her HOA president hat," Tom corrected, "which might be worse." From the pool, Emma's voice called out, "Dad, can Madison and Mason stay for lunch? We're playing mermaids, and they're really good at holding tea." Karen's second email arrived at 3:47 p.m., during what Tom had optimistically assumed would be the calm portion of their Tuesday. The subject line read, "Urgent, Willowbrook Estates Community Standards. Violation required response within 48 hours." Tom opened it while watching the children play Marco Polo, their joyful shouts echoing across the neighborhood, like some kind of acoustic evidence of their crimes against suburban tranquility. This email was different from Karen's morning missive, where the first had been diplomatic warfare disguised as neighborly concern. This one dropped all pretense of courtesy. "Dear Mr. and Mrs. Henderson," it began, "following our conversation this morning, I have completed a comprehensive review of the ongoing violations occurring at 1247 Maple. Documentation indicates 17 separate breaches of community standards, 3 potential municipal code violations, and escalating insurance liability concerns that pose significant risk to all Willowbrook Estates residents." Sarah read over his shoulder, her grip tightening on his arm with each paragraph. "This is certifiably insane," she whispered. "She's treating our pool like it's some kind of toxic waste site." But Karen was just getting started. The email detailed a systematic catalog of violations that would have impressed a federal prosecutor. She'd documented excessive noise levels exceeding residential zone guidelines, unauthorized recreational equipment creating safety hazards, and failure to maintain proper supervision ratios for aquatic activities. Most disturbing was her detailed log of pool usage. Monday, July 15th. Madison and Mason Whitmore arrived at 9:23 a.m. without parental supervision. Noise violations began at 9:31 a.m. and continued intermittently until 4:17 p.m. Unauthorized equipment included 2 pool noodles, 1 inflatable unicorn, and 1 improvised diving platform constructed from household items. Tuesday, July 16th. Multiple violations occurred between 8:45 a.m. and 5:23 p.m. Additional participants included the Morrison children unauthorized, the Chen family children unauthorized, and 3 unidentified minors. Significant security concern. "She's been keeping a log," Tom said faintly, with timestamps she recorded when individual children entered and left our backyard. Sarah was scrolling through the attachments, which had expanded from yesterday's 43 pages to what appeared to be a comprehensive legal brief. "Tom, she's included photographs. She took pictures of our pool. The photos were professional quality, clearly taken from Karen's kitchen window with telephoto precision. They showed children mid-splash, pool toys scattered across the deck, and water levels that Karen had apparently marked with digital measurement tools to document water displacement beyond acceptable residential parameters." "This is stalking," Sarah said flatly. "She's been surveilling our backyard like we're running a drug operation." Tom was reading Karen's proposed immediate compliance plan, which read like a peace treaty designed by someone who'd recently conquered a small nation. The terms included immediate cessation of all unauthorized recreational activities, removal of all non-approved pool equipment within 24 hours, implementation of mandatory quiet hours from 9 p.m. to 7 a.m. and 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. guest registration system, requiring 48-hour advance notice for any non-resident pool access, installation of sound dampening barriers to minimize noise transmission, comprehensive insurance review with HOA approval before any resumption of pool activities, sound dampening barriers. Tom's voice was climbing toward the same octave Sarah had achieved that morning. She wants us to build a sound wall around our pool so children can't be heard laughing. The email concluded with what Karen probably thought was a reasonable compromise. If these measures seem excessive, the HOA board would be willing to consider alternative solutions, including temporary pool closure during peak neighborhood hours or transition to adults-only pool usage, until appropriate safety and noise control measures can be implemented. Tom's phone immediately rang. Mark Whitmore's name appeared on the screen. "That's Karen's husband," Tom told Sarah, who was staring at the phone like it might spontaneously combust. "Answer it," she said. "I want to hear this, Tom." Mark's voice was strained, carrying the exhausted tone of someone who'd been married to Karen Whitmore for 15 years. "Hey, I just wanted to call and apologize, I guess. Karen showed me the emails." "Mark, what the hell is going on? Your wife is documenting our children's pool activities like she's conducting a federal investigation." "I know. I tried to talk to her, but when Karen gets focused on a project," Mark trailed off, and Tom could practically hear him running his hands through his hair. "Look, Madison and Mason have been coming home talking about how much fun they're having at your place. They love swimming with Emma and Jake. Then why is Karen trying to shut down children's pool parties? Because she's been the HOA president for 3 years, and she genuinely believes that maintaining neighborhood standards is her personal responsibility, and because, double quotes Mark, paused. "Tom, can I be completely honest with you, please? Karen's been talking about running for city council next year. She thinks her HOA experience demonstrates her commitment to community leadership and regulatory oversight. Every neighborhood issue becomes a campaign platform for her." Sarah grabbed the phone. "Mark, this is Sarah. Are you telling us that Karen's using our pool situation as some kind of political resume builder?" "I'm telling you that Karen sees every neighborhood conflict as an opportunity to demonstrate executive decision-making and crisis management skills. And Tom, your refusal to implement her compliance plan has become a test case for her leadership effectiveness." Tom felt something cold settle in his stomach. "So this isn't really about noise ordinances or insurance liability. This is about Karen proving that she can enforce community standards even when residents resist voluntary cooperation. She's treating your pool like a campaign issue." Sarah was silent for a moment, processing the implications. "Mark, what happens if we just ignore her? What can she actually do?" "Well, she's already scheduled a special HOA board meeting for Thursday night to address ongoing community standards violations. She's prepared a presentation with photos, documentation, and a formal request for enforcement action. Enforcement action, fines, mostly. The HOA can levy penalties for violations of community standards, and if those aren't paid, they can put a lien on your property." Tom sat down heavily on his deck chair. "She's going to fine us for letting children swim in our pool. She's going to fine you for operating an unauthorized recreational facility in violation of noise ordinances, safety regulations, and community aesthetic standards." Mark corrected. "Karen's very precise about these things." Sarah was pacing now, her flip-flops slapping against the deck with increasing intensity. "This is America. She can't fine people for children swimming in their backyard pools." "Actually," interrupted Janet Morrison, standing from her seat near the back, "I think we need to discuss those investigative procedures." "Karen, did you take photographs of my children without my permission?" The room went silent except for the hum of fluorescent lights and the scratch of pens on paper as several residents began taking notes. Karen felt heat rising in her cheeks, but maintained her professional composure. "Documentation of community standards violations is standard procedure. Mrs. Morrison, the photographs were taken from my own property and focus on regulatory compliance issues, not individual residents." "That's not what I asked," Janet pressed. "Did you take photographs of my 7-year-old twins while they were swimming at the Henderson pool?" Karen glanced at her laptop screen, where her carefully prepared presentation included several photos that prominently featured the Morrison children mid-cannonball. "Visual documentation is necessary to demonstrate the scope and severity of ongoing violations." "So yes," Janet said flatly, "you photographed my children without permission to build a case against our neighbors for letting kids swim in their pool." Board member Patricia Chen was looking increasingly uncomfortable. "Karen, what specific authority does the HOA have to conduct photographic surveillance of residents' activities on their own property?" Karen pulled up her governance documents, scrolling to the section she'd highlighted specifically for this question. HOA Covenants, Section 4.7b. Grants the board investigative authority to document violations of community standards when voluntary compliance cannot be achieved. "Does that include photographing children?" asked David Chen, from the middle of the room. "It includes documenting activities that violate established regulations, regardless of the age of participants." Sarah Henderson stood up, holding her own folder of documents. "Karen, you sent us 43 pages of regulations claiming we were operating an unauthorized recreational facility, but when I researched those regulations, half of them don't actually apply to residential pools, and the other half require specific circumstances that don't exist in our situation." Karen's presentation had not accounted for this level of preparation. From the Henderson family, Mrs. Henderson, regulatory interpretation requires expertise in municipal code and community standards enforcement. The board has consulted with appropriate authorities. Which authorities? Sarah interrupted. Because I called the city planning office, and they said residential pools don't require recreational facility licensing unless they're open to the people. By 9:47 p.m., the Willowbrook Estates Community Center had transformed from a routine HOA meeting into something resembling a town hall revolution. Karen sat at the head table, her laptop closed, watching 3 years of carefully constructed authority evaporate under the collective fury of parents who just learned their HOA president had been conducting surveillance operations on their children's pool parties. The final blow had come when Janet Morrison read Karen's own words back to her from the compliance email. Failure to maintain proper supervision ratios for aquatic activities. Janet's voice had carried across the silent room as she asked, Karen, are you suggesting that parents in this community don't properly supervise their own children? Karen had tried to explain that she was referring to safety protocols for informal recreational facilities, but the damage was done. In attempting to regulate the Henderson pool situation with professional precision, she'd inadvertently accused half the neighborhood of inadequate parenting. The vote was unanimous, 4-0 with Karen abstaining. The board formally rejected all proposed enforcement measures against the Henderson family and established new policies requiring community notification before any resident surveillance activities. Karen's photographic evidence was ordered destroyed, and her documentation procedures were suspended pending a comprehensive review of HOA governance practices. As residents filed out of the community center, many stopped to speak with Tom and Sarah Henderson, offering pool party invitations and expressing support for their decision to resist Karen's regulatory overreach. The Hendersons had become neighborhood heroes, while Karen had become the cautionary tale about HOA presidents who forgot that community leadership meant serving residents, not surveilling them. Karen drove home in silence, her victory presentation still unopened on her laptop, her documentation folder intact but irrelevant. She'd prepared for compliance discussions and enforcement procedures, not for a community-wide rejection of her leadership philosophy. Mark was waiting in their kitchen when she arrived home. 2 cups of tea cooling on the counter, and the patient expression of someone who'd been married to Karen long enough to recognize when her ambitions had collided with reality. So, he said gently, how did the meeting go? Karen set her laptop on the counter and stared out the kitchen window toward the Henderson backyard, where pool lights were still glowing and the sound of laughter occasionally drifted across the fence. They voted against all enforcement measures. Unanimous. I'm sorry, honey. I know you worked hard on the presentation. Mark, they made me look like some kind of surveillance operative who spends her time photographing children, instead of maintaining community standards. Patricia Chen asked if I needed professional help dealing with neighbor conflicts. Mark was quiet for a moment, processing the implications. Karen, maybe this is an opportunity to step back and think about what kind of HOA president you want to be for your final year. Karen's final year. She'd been so focused on building her city council campaign portfolio that she'd forgotten her HOA term was ending in 6 months. The Henderson pool situation was supposed to demonstrate executive leadership and crisis management skills, but instead it had become the defining failure of her presidency. I think I need to resign, Karen said quietly. Do you want to resign, or do you think you should resign? The question forced Karen to confront what she'd been avoiding all evening. Did she want to continue as HOA president after tonight's humiliation? Did she want to spend her remaining months trying to rebuild trust with neighbors who now viewed her as an overzealous enforcement officer rather than a community leader? I wanted to make Willowbrook Estates the best neighborhood in the city, Karen said finally. I wanted our property values to be protected, our standards to be maintained, and our community to be something residents could be proud of. And you accomplished that, Karen. Property values are up, the neighborhood looks great, and most residents are happy here. But maybe the cost was too high. Maybe community leadership isn't about preventing every possible problem before it happens. Maybe it's about trusting residents to be reasonable people who can work out minor conflicts without regulatory oversight. Karen looked at her laptop, where months of documentation and enforcement procedures were stored like evidence of her dedication to community service. All of her careful work, all of her proactive problem solving, all of her attempts to maintain neighborhood excellence had been reduced to an embarrassing surveillance scandal. The Henderson kids are probably still swimming, she said, watching the pool lights shimmer through her kitchen window. Does that bother you? Karen considered the question honestly. The sound of children laughing in backyard pools, neighbors sharing recreational facilities, families building friendships through informal community interactions. Did any of that actually threaten the community standards she'd worked so hard to maintain? No, she admitted. It doesn't bother me. What bothers me is that I turned something innocent into a regulatory crisis because I was more concerned about potential problems than actual community harmony. Mark joined her at the window, where they could see the Henderson backyard glowing with pool lights and summer evening warmth. Madison and Mason were probably inside now, tired from another day of swimming and friendship, completely unaware that their pool parties had triggered a neighborhood political crisis. Karen, do you remember why you ran for HOA president? She'd run because the previous board had been passive about maintenance issues, inconsistent about covenant enforcement, and generally ineffective at addressing resident concerns. Karen had promised proactive leadership, comprehensive problem solving, and professional management of community standards. I wanted to make sure problems were addressed before they became crises, Karen said. And instead, you created a crisis out of children swimming in their neighbor's pool. The irony was inescapable. Karen's entire presidency had been built on preventing the kind of neighborhood conflict that had erupted tonight, but her prevention methods had caused exactly the kind of community division she'd been trying to avoid. I need to apologize to the Hendersons, Karen said. That would be a good start. Karen pulled out her phone and began composing a text message, then stopped. An apology text wasn't sufficient for the scope of her surveillance operation and regulatory overreach. The Hendersons deserved a face-to-face conversation and a genuine acknowledgement of how badly she'd handled the entire situation. But as she prepared to walk across the yard to their front door, Karen noticed something that made her pause. The Henderson pool lights were turning off, one by one, as the family prepared for bed. The sound of laughter had faded to the comfortable quiet of a summer evening, and the neighborhood was settling into the peaceful rhythm of suburban nighttime tomorrow. The Henderson children would probably invite Madison and Mason for another day of swimming. The pool parties would continue, the neighborhood friendships would strengthen, and Willowbrook Estates would remain the kind of community where families looked out for each other, and children could enjoy innocent summer fun, all without regulatory oversight, documentation procedures, or enforcement mechanisms. Maybe that was the lesson she needed to learn from this entire disaster. Maybe effective community leadership wasn't about preventing every possible problem or documenting every potential violation. Maybe it was about trusting residents to be decent neighbors and intervening only when trust and goodwill weren't sufficient to resolve actual conflicts. Karen looked at her laptop again, then closed it without opening her documentation files. Tomorrow, she would apologize to the Hendersons, submit her resignation to the HOA board, and spend her remaining months as a regular resident of Willowbrook Estates instead of its self-appointed regulatory enforcement officer. But tonight, she had one more task to complete. Karen walked to her storage shed and pulled out the stepladder she'd used for countless home maintenance projects over the years. She carried it to the fence between her yard and the Hendersons, positioned it carefully, and climbed up to peer over into their backyard. The pool was dark now, its surface perfectly still except for the gentle filter circulation that would keep the water clean for tomorrow's activities. Pool toys were neatly arranged on the deck, chairs positioned for optimal adult supervision, and safety equipment properly stored according to municipal guidelines. The Hendersons had been running their pool exactly as responsible homeowners should. The children had been supervised, the equipment had been maintained, and the activities had been appropriate for residential recreation. Karen's surveillance had documented not violations of community standards, but evidence of a family sharing their resources with neighbors and creating the kind of community connections that made Willowbrook Estates special. Karen climbed down from the stepladder and returned it to the shed. Then she walked back to her kitchen, opened her laptop, and began deleting files. The photographic evidence of Henderson pool violations disappeared first, followed by her surveillance logs, regulatory interpretations, and enforcement recommendations. 3 months of documentation vanished with a few keystrokes, leaving no trace of her misguided investigation into children's pool parties. When she finished, Karen's laptop contained only scanned